Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, karanga mai mihi mai, and welcome. Ko Khylee Mercier toko ingoa. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the New Zealand Drug Foundation. If you don't know us, we're a charitable trust, independent of the government, and we're based here in Wellington. And one of our many roles is to facilitate community discussion on drug law. So as you'll all know, there's a referendum on the 19th of September to discuss the legalisation of adult use of cannabis. And that question will ask you to answer yes or no to the implementation of a bill called the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. So that's what we're talking about today. I'm really pleased you could make it. A few housekeeping things before I introduce our wonderful panel, who you can see here. Firstly, this is a webinar rather than a meeting. So you can see us, but we cannot see you or hear you. But you can communicate with us through the chat function and through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screens if you're on a laptop, elsewhere if you're on a phone. So feel free to use that chat function to talk to each other, to introduce yourself, to say where you're calling in from. If you want to ask us a question, use the Q&A. That's mostly where I'll be looking to see if there's any questions. So this is also on Facebook Live and will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel later on, so you can catch up there if you miss anything. We've also got moderator Stephen, who is from the Drug Foundation, and Tom, who's on the tech stuff, so welcome to them too. And now I will introduce our wonderful panelists. We have Selah Hart, who's sitting to my bottom left, but could be anywhere on your screens. Selah has whakapapa links to Ngāti Kuia, Ngai Tahu, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngāti Apa ki Te Rā Tō, and Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa. She's the Chief Executive Officer at Hapai te Hauora, which is a national Māori public health organisation, and they work to address health inequities for Māori and do a lot of work on addiction, particularly tobacco and gambling. She's been at Hapai for 10 years, so welcome, Selah. Do you want to say hi and maybe say a few words about your interest in this issue and Hapai's interest in this issue?
Oh, kia ora tātou, kia ora Khylee, for your lovely Māori pronunciation. I really give it up to you. I put you under the pump there a little bit with all my iwi, but kia ora tātou katoa. We are really blessed to be here today. As an organisation, I stand with my team behind me and around me to ensure that as spokespeople in our own rights and as individuals and as iwi members, we can contribute to this kōrero, and I think it is a very important one to be had right now. As an organisation, we are funded by the Ministry of Health and so have a responsibility to understand and address issues pertaining to Māori wellness, inequities, and other such issues in which we face on a day-to-day basis, cannabis being just one of those many issues. So thank you very much for having me here today. I really look forward to the kōrero.
Kia ora. So we've also got Tracey Potiki here, who is Alcohol and Other Drug Innovation Project Leader at Hauora, which is also a national organisation. They specialise in Māori workforce development in the areas of Māori public health, mental health and addiction. Their aim is to strengthen health workforces to decrease Māori inequity and increase Māori wellbeing and potential. And Tracey works in the innovation space, which means she's tasked with coming up with new solutions to fix old problems about how we treat alcohol and other drug issues. And Tracey's been a passionate advocate in this space for about 20 years now, so really looking forward to hearing from her. Tracey whakapapas to Kai Tahu, and she's based down in lovely Ōtepoti, which is where I also grew up, so welcome. Tell us how the weather is down there and what your involvement is in this issue, Tracey.
Oh, tēnā koutou, kei te mihi o te rohi nei, ki o koutou ka tupuna, ka iwi, ka hapu, ka marae, aku mihi ki a koutou katoa. Yeah, so yep, I'm Tracey, and my interest in this issue is about needing a change, I think. I work for an amazing organisation called Te Hauora, and you know, we get to do all sorts of amazing stuff in our communities, and we also get to see the impact of you know, drug harm and other harms as a result of poor policy decisions and a lack of commitment from government around how they include us in the solutions that we know are needed for our communities. So it's lovely to be here. We're partnered with the New Zealand Drug Foundation and are part of the Health Not Handcuffs Coalition. So ngā mihi ki a koutou.
Welcome. So, and last but certainly not least is the lovely Khylee Quince, who is Ngāpuhi and Ngāti Porou and is a senior lecturer and associate head of school at the AUT School of Law. She has 20 years experience teaching and researching criminal law, youth justice and Māori and their interactions with the criminal justice system. And you may well have seen her on TV or on the radio lately. Especially lately, there seems to be a lot of things to talk about in this space. So she's been appearing from anything ranging from cannabis law reform to police violence and armed responses to the COVID contact tracing app I believe you were interviewed on recently. So she's also on the Drug Foundation board, and we're very lucky to have her. She's one very busy lady. So welcome, Khylee, and maybe say hi and then tell us a little bit about why you've become interested in this issue.
Sure, morena tātou, tēnei te mihi māhana kia koutou, morena wāhine mā. Thank you, Khylee. So as Khylee has really fleshed out my interest in this kaupapa, cannabis is no different. My interest in cannabis law reform is really no different to my interest in criminal justice generally. So the police and system response to Māori in relation to cannabis and drug-related offences is the same as it is to their responses in relation to any other type of offending. The difference is that we have an opportunity to change that in relation to the upcoming referendum. So that's pretty significant. So thinking about having alternative responses to cannabis-related offending and thinking about not just offending, but the other health-related issues and the potential of a legal market. Those are all take that are particularly important to Māori communities and whānau. So that's really my professional interest, if you like, my personal interest. I'm a mum of 3 teenagers. I want to know that my 3 young people, if they do happen to tutu with cannabis, that they're not going to have lifelong consequences as a result of being disengaged from school or being harmed by cannabis-related convictions that can damage them for the rest of their lives in terms of travel and education and employment. So a couple of different hats. Thanks for having us.
Hapai, great to have you guys here. And I probably should just quickly say what the Drug Foundation's interest in this issue is as well. So we really recognise that more than for any other group, drug law reform is a big issue for tangata whenua. As these guys have already mentioned, most Māori have seen the human cost of our bad drug law firsthand. Most people that are, or the preponderant group of people that are harmed by our drug law are Māori, are young, are male, which we think is unacceptable. And so we don't agree with a criminal justice approach to drug use. We think it's actively harmful way of dealing with things, and not only that, it doesn't address the health issues that drug use can cause in the way that we'd like to see it, we'd like to see happen. So last year we did a lot of work with our Māori partners in this space to try to ensure that the cannabis legalisation and control bill would really reflect Māori concerns and would lead to better outcomes for Māori. Now the bill is here, it's landed. It's a big old thing, it's 160 pages approximately. And there's a fair bit in there which attempts to promote better outcomes for Māori in the health and justice spaces and economic development spaces as well. So from a Drug Foundation perspective, just in general, in terms of how it affects the whole population from a public health perspective, we're really thrilled with it, and we think it's a sort of a world-leading model of public, how you regulate a harmful substance to promote public health. But having done all that work last year, we were really keen to bring together a panel of experts to talk about what does this bill mean for Māori health and justice and economic outcomes. What's the good? What are the bits that are great? What are the bits that we need to work on a bit more at select committee if this referendum goes through? So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions that I've prepared myself First, because I just wanted to make sure we cover all the main bases up front, and then I'll be taking questions from the audience after that. So yeah, I'm going to start with you, Selah, in the Māori public health space. So the bill's purpose is quite cool. It's to reduce cannabis-related harm to individuals, family, whānau and communities. And it tries to do that by implementing a whole raft of different public health interventions. For example, raising awareness of the health risks associated with cannabis use, and requiring a drug harm reduction strategy to be developed, and getting taxes specifically to put towards doing that. There'll also be really strict rules around where cannabis can be sold, because no one wants to encourage cannabis use to be normalised any more than it already is normalised. So I'm keen to know from a health perspective, given Māori communities in particular suffer a good deal of harm from drug use of cannabis and other drugs, are the health protections in the bill, do you think, sufficient to make you feel confident that this bill would lead to better health outcomes for Māori overall than prohibition? Yeah.
Oh, kia ora, Khylee. Yeah, I think that firstly it's a shift away, or a shift in the way in which we view substance use and substance dependence as a health issue. So I think that if we really start to think about a change in framing what this means for our communities, it's an important shift in terms of ensuring that the appropriate responses to harmful cannabis use, particularly for Māori, how that's actually addressed. It's not just lock and key. You know, we need to actually be looking at in the year 2020, what does this mean really for our communities? How do we ensure that we are keeping our communities as safe as possible? Because we do understand that there are implications around safety in general and utilisation of drugs potentially being a precursor for things that might be end in harmful circumstances for individuals or for whānau communities. But we also need to then understand and unpack what that looks like in regards to intergenerational addiction, and how we start to move and understand and grow our responses to that instead of just that lock and key approach. I think in public health we acknowledge that regulations can either have a devastating impact on us or an absolutely successful outcome, and so we're always sitting on the fence in regards to, you know, which way are we going to go and how's this going to really flow out for us as Māori. So I think that until we understand truly what this looks like, and if the country want to see a yes in September, then we really need to that's when the hard yards really start for us, and we need to ensure that we get ourselves on the right path. That this isn't going to cause any more harm, that it's actually going to be a better solution than what we've had over the past, 40 years. From what we can see in the bill, it does ensure that there is a balance between education, prevention and accessibility. So we're really encouraged by the importance that it's been placed on those components, ensuring that we're looking to draw whānau away from the illegal market. But whilst also ensuring that, coupled with that, we are educating whānau and communities on the potential risks of utilisation of this product. We know that through this work there will be regulation around quality and potency, and I think we might touch on that a little bit later. The limitations around advertising need to be, you know, there, because we don't want it to be a free-for-all. We're going to see all these new campaigns and advertising strategies that, you know, are across other harmful commodities that we see in New Zealand, and so we wouldn't want to go down that track. And we want to ensure that, or we're really positive around the strict rules that are going to be in place around the cannabis shops, or, you know, the way in which we can purchase these products. In the current unregulated market, we don't have any controls over any of those things, and so I think that if we're looking to take a step forward, not stay status quo or go backwards, there is potential for some good, balanced public health approaches to cannabis use in New Zealand. I do want to sort of reflect on how we match cannabis use or the associated harms or goods through this legislation in comparison to, you know, the likes of tobacco and alcohol, both legal products in New Zealand, both cause a lot of harm. And how we ensure to understand that outside of the physical and individual health impacts, it's actually the oversaturation of outlets and availability of these types of products, tobacco and alcohol, and where they're strategically placed in our low socioeconomic communities where a lot of our whānau Māori live. And so we see devastating impacts on our whānau because of that. And so I think that this bill really needs to ensure that we cover that off from the outset, that we have a balanced approach or a way in which we ensure to not just place these products or oversaturate accessibility to these products in those places that are already overrepresented with fast food outlets, with tobacco stores and with alcohol stores. So that is something we want to be really mindful of should there be a yes in September. There are some really good things, though, obviously, around the limited shop hours or, availability hours, the minimum age being of 20 years of age. I think that that's a really critical thing that we probably need to talk about across the other harmful commodities that are available in New Zealand. And the other restrictions, I suppose, around the appearance of the stores and staff who are selling these products, having the appropriate host responsibility training, product health and safety labelling on the products that might be for sale, and again that banning of advertising. So I think that there are some really promising things that we can see in the current legislation as it sits, but obviously it always comes down to how that actually comes into effect when and if that happens. We also see some potential opportunities with regards to enabling better access for medicinal cannabis, making it easier or more affordable potentially. And if cannabis is regulated, then this will give us the opportunity to have an academic research base, which we currently can't really have because it is an illegal substance in New Zealand. So one of the things that we are really strong on wanting from the outset is a dedicated fund and a research agenda that looks to ensure that we are marking all the way through this process, if it is to be legalised, that we are capturing that data, that information, that research, and building in a New Zealand approach to how we're evaluating at all stages whether this has done better for us or worse, and then how do we reevaluate and reset ourselves if needed through that process. And then I suppose it's more so around, as an organisation, we have made sure to not be yes or no. We want to enable our whānau and our communities that we represent are given all the information that they are required to make their own decision. That is part of tino rangatiratanga. That is not for us to determine on behalf of our whānau and our iwi, because we do know that there are some very strong viewpoints. But I think that this might be the precursor to removing some of that societal stigma. Because at the end of the day, if we're looking at placing this in the same sort of category as tobacco or alcohol, if it is to become a legal product, then we need to ensure that we treat people with fairness, that it is an addiction, that it is a dependence on things. I'm sure everyone has some sort of dependence on something. It could be your morning coffee. You can't get away with without starting the day with that. So, there is many things that we need to, as a society, start to relook at and reframe our thinking, and I think that this is a positive step, but we need to make sure that it's done right. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Yeah, loads of really interesting stuff there. Thanks, Selah. So did Khylee or Tracey, do you have anything you want to add from your perspective on the health, the potential health outcomes of the bill? Tracey?
Oh, I just support what Selah's saying, and really wanted to reiterate the importance of that those review points. I noticed in the bill that there was a 5-year point, and yeah, I just think that that's too long for us. That we need something that is faster and sharper if we're going to really monitor the impact of a potential change within our communities. So yeah, just wanted to fully support what Selah's her kōrero. Right.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Khylee?
I'd just say, again, tautoko what Selah said, and particularly reiterate in terms of the potential for inequality in access to services. So currently there is inequality in terms of access to services. What we don't want is a mismatch where you have access to the product legally and then don't have access to services. So, and I think the risk, of course, why I think that's relevant to Māori hapori is because currently there are many communities in which there is very poor infrastructure across the board, not just infrastructure in relation to access to healthcare, but generally speaking in terms of education and all other infrastructure. So what we don't want is to see, a rollout, even if it doesn't get to saturation level, but for example, in Hokianga, I would not want to see, a licensed outlet with no corresponding access to services. So there should be some parity of access between access to the substance and access to help. So, yeah, just ensuring that. Yeah, I think the risk is around really areas of high deprivation of not saturation, but also making sure there's access.
Yeah, that's a really cool point. And I know the bill has really tried to come up with a new solution to what we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, in the way that we have the local alcohol plans, which have not worked well because alcohol has tried to stop people being able to to reduce the opening hours or to reduce the shop density in poorer areas. Hopefully the way they've set it up here will be better, but the devil's always in the detail, but it'll be set at the national level rather than local level, but local authorities will have a say over it as well. So I'll be interested to see how that really works out. But yeah, making sure that health, there's also health stuff in the same places that the shops are is really key. Khylee, I had a question for you next on so from our perspective at the Drug Foundation, one of the coolest things about legalising cannabis is it means we'll stop criminalising people for using cannabis and messing up their lives for selling it as well. And instead taxes will be put towards this sort of comprehensive, hopefully, health approach instead. As we know, criminal justice burden falls to Māori, which is completely unjust, but we don't want to take away that prohibition model with all its penalties and replace it with another model which has similar justice outcomes, where Māori and other vulnerable populations end up disproportionately suffering the outcome. So do you think that this bill has got that right in terms of they need to come up with a way to enforce the new model, obviously, but not to recriminalise the people they're trying to stop criminalising? Do you think that the bill does that well?
All right, Paito Pato, good question. And I'd answer that first by having a really quick recap of the whakapapa of the Enforcement of Misuse of Drugs Act offences. So we have the current situation is that cannabis is illegal. It has been illegal for 40 years, or slightly longer, 50 odd years. And so technically speaking, it is until we pass this bill, it will be illegal. However, it has not been enforced as a matter of legality for more than 20 years. So on the books, it is still prohibited. For the past 20 years, the police have changed their means of enforcement, which means that separate from the law, the police have made decisions around discretion and diversion that has meant that most people caught with low-level cannabis-related offences, which is just possession, have not been dragged into the criminal justice system. So we know that the only people that have been tend to have been young people, males and Māori. And so while we've seen a huge decrease in the past 20 years of formal justice responses to low-level drug-related offending, Māori have not gained the benefit of that policy. Last year, we saw some tutuing with that legislation, so an amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act, which has now put the obligation on the police to justify a decision to prosecute. So there is now slightly strengthened, but again, there's been concern from Māori in particularly that we're not going to gain the benefit of that discretion either. So The benefit of this law is that legalisation, as opposed to that other part of that story, which is a story around decriminalisation, legalisation is black and white. It means that the substance is no longer unlawful, that low-level possession within the boundaries of this new regime is black and white. You cannot be convicted of possession within the boundaries of the statute. So legally speaking, that will make a difference, and it'll make a difference in a number of ways. So you can no longer be arrested for possession. You can no longer be convicted for possession. It can also no longer be used as a means to a gateway, in the sense of opening the door for the police to be able to search your whare, to be able to search your car, search your person on suspicion of possession of cannabis. That will make a huge difference to Māori communities. So what have they replaced it with? That was Khylee's question. They've replaced it with, those were proper criminal offences. They've now replaced most of that type of offending will no longer be unlawful. There are new offences. For example, so the legislation or the draft bill sets out that you cannot smoke if you're under 20. So if you are under 20, there are, most of the new offences are what we call regulatory type offences. So it's not really like a criminal conviction. It's a fine similar to what you would receive for driving, minor driving offences. So running a red light perhaps, failure to wear a seatbelt. So it's a couple of $100 fine. So the types of regulatory offences that replace formerly, more serious criminal offences will include possessing more than the allowable home grow limit to an extent. So having more than 4 plants in your household. If you're a one-person household, having more than 2 plants, but no more than 10. So it is really de-escalated, if you like, the seriousness of the low-level type offences. It has, however, maintained, if many people are concerned that this opens the door to serious drug-related offending, serious drug-related offending remains serious, and it remains a criminal offence. So you can still go to prison, for example, for supply of a minor. That's a serious criminal offence. So really strong public messaging that Selah's talked about already, but maintaining a hard line on criminal justice for supply to young people, for manufacturing outside of the, or growing outside of the legal boundaries or regimes for serious offences. So generally speaking, I think that's all good news. I have a couple of concerns from a Māori perspective. One of them, for example, is around deprivation. So the limit, for example, so things that I'm slightly concerned about is around deprivation. So Māori, and not necessarily deprivation, it might just be a matter of cultural difference. The limit, the home grow exemption limit, is 2 plants per person, per person aged 20 or over, to a maximum of 4 plants per whare. If you live in a whare of more than 2 adults over 20, which is a lot of Māori whānau and a lot of Māori whare, you cannot have your 2 plants. You are still restricted to 4 plants per whare. That was one of the things that I raised with the team who were drafting the bill, to say that doesn't take into account cultural difference in the way that we live intergenerationally, or whether it's a matter of deprivation, that we just live in larger households with more adults. It's problematic for young people who may be living in flatting situations, so in non-family based situations. So there's a potential issue there in terms of over-policing of certain types of households. The other thing I'm slightly concerned about, but I understand again the public messaging and the public health justification that Selah's mentioned, is keeping cannabis consumption out of public spaces. So in other words, there will still be policing of people who consume cannabis publicly. So there is an ability to smoke in private homes. There is an ability to potentially smoke in licensed consumption spaces. Who does that leave out in the cold then? Generally young people over 20, or young people generally, and people who do not have a whare. So if you are homeless, or if you so police tend to surveil people who are out in public. So there's a potential issue there in terms of over-policing. We do not want a heavy hand by the police in relation to perhaps the homeless, people who may well be the people that Tracey will talk about in terms of people who have serious addiction issues. So there's a potential issue there. So generally speaking, from a criminal justice perspective, I think this is all good news. So there's a line drawn. There are still serious, criminal offences and the possibility of imprisonment for serious drug offenders. For everybody else, there's the sort of in-between space, if you like, where there will be fines, but without necessarily having those long-term problems that come, or consequences that come with criminal convictions, which are restrictions in life pathways, including education, the ability to get a job, the ability to keep a job, the ability to travel. So most of those restrictions will no longer be an issue for low-level drug convictions, or low-level drug use, under a legalised regime in the terms of that bill that we have before us.
Yep. Well, it's got to be a good thing, hopefully. Do you guys, Selah and Tracey, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Just that, the devil is always in the detail, and even like I was thinking about, that fining system potentially. So it reminds me of what happens now with some of our rangatahi, particularly our young male, rangatahi, and that they get a parking ticket or a driving offence, and often it's a staggering or a build-up of fines and very minor offences, which they first come to the notice of the court. So, I think that, yes, this has definitely moved in the right direction in terms of decriminalising, disrupting that what's currently happening, or that bias which is being applied by the police. But I think the real issue here is over-policing of all of our people for whatever reason. And I think the real issue is systematic discrimination against Māori, wherever we are, in all of the places we are. And really that's a bigger conversation that the whole nation need to engage in. Yeah. So but yep. Completely agree with
absolutely agree. Fines are often the gateway, as you say, Tracey, into much more serious criminal justice outcomes. So failure to pay a fine eventually leads to actual criminal conviction. So so looking at this as the lesser of two evils is, as you say, isn't necessarily the case when you fail to take account of one, over policing, two, socioeconomic deprivation. That means that for communities who are less able to pay fiscal penalties, if that's the option that there is. Yeah, completely agree.
Yep. So better than what we've got now, but not the magic bullet.
Aye.
Yep.
Aye.
Cool. Well, Tracey, I wanted to ask you, so we've talked about health and justice. I wanted to just talk to you quickly, and I noticed there's a couple of questions on this area as well, around economic, social equity, and what that, what impacts there might be from the bill around that area. So there are some key social equity principles built into the bill, which are intended to help Māori communities specifically. So, for example, when determining how to allocate a licence for growing, those people who can show they've got social equity principles built into their application are more likely to get a licence. So if they can show partnership with people who are locally affected from prohibition, for example. What do you think this all might look like in practice? Will it be enough to ensure equitable access to cannabis cultivation licences, for example? Will it go some way towards addressing the harms of prohibition? What's your take on that?
Yeah. What is my take on that? Well, firstly, I'm a recovering person, so I gave up cannabis, and in a different life, I grew cannabis and quite a lot of it, and was quite good at it. and you know, back in the day, and you know, I'm surrounded by whānau who still grow to this day. They're still growing, you know, for personal use, and I think about some of our areas, you know, like my eldest boy is tūhoi on his dad's side, and you know, he was born in Murupara, and just round the road in Kaingaroa. You know, we know that cannabis is part of the economy there, you know, and as the same in other places, and what we're talking about here is moving from a legal market or an illegal framework into a legal framework, and whether Māori will be able to participate in that legal framework. The real question, I think, is, do Māori want to participate in the legal framework, and in what that might look like? The other part of that is you know, that idea of partnership. You know, we Māori have advocated long and hard for a long period of time to be involved as a partner in all decisions that impact, affect, and you know, are about us. And we're consistently disappointed by our treaty partners' inability to engage in a meaningful way with us. And that's not to say that that I don't think that that, you know, we should vote no, because I actually think, and this is someone who doesn't use cannabis at all, I actually think that it's a big yes from me, and I have some clear reasons for doing that. It will reduce harm, I believe. It will address some of the issues around stigmatisation. I think that it will remove that stigma that's currently sitting around cannabis use, and it will stop some of the people in my own whānau from being more criminalised and more stigmatised by what they're doing now. On a personal note, I don't think that cannabis enhances wairoa, so it's not something that that I think is necessarily good. But I think that you know, if we're thinking about people's mana motuhake, then we have to think about their right to choose their lifestyle, to choose what they do and what they don't do. But I am real about the harms that are associated with cannabis use. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, Khylee. The economy, you know, I like some parts of it. I like some parts of what it's talking about. If we come back to the overall purpose of the bill, which is harm reduction, then I think that's a good place to focus. I don't imagine that there's going to be a whole lot of iwi who are going to enter into this particular market. That's just I think that.
And can I say something about that? And I hope not, to be honest. We've got other priorities, you know, like for Pākehā people and others. A lot of these people come to this as a single issue kaupapa. We've got a whole lot of other things around health, housing, education. This is one tiny thing that we can make better, not fix, make better, and sort of divert some of the harms into a more appropriate response. But hey, we've got other things to do. And while I support this this referendum and the bill, I'll be there protesting if Ngāpuhi wants to get involved in this with our settlement money we don't even have yet, then no, you know, I think that would be appalling. There are far better things that we can, you know, that we can spend our hard-earned guilt money from the Crown on than getting into the cannabis industry. But as both Selah and Tracey have said, that is part of rangatiratanga and mana motuhake. That is for tribal peoples to decide for themselves. So that's one issue. The tribal space but there's also the Māori in private space, which is, you know, the companies, corporations that will have the right to enter the market. And so one of the things that this legislation does is attempts to, I see John's asked a question about past historic convictions. It attempts to carve out part of the market for Māori, whether it's in the private or public sense, public being iwi or hapu, I mean, or via companies, allows Māori as applicants, whether they're groups or individuals, and historic convictions for low-level related cannabis convictions will not be a barrier to allow people to apply to be license holders. So the big picture is that part of the market is reserved, if you like, that there is the ability for Māori to enter that market. There are quite strong messages that the detail again will be in the regulations around not having monopolisation of the market by big cannabis companies, which is one of the mistakes that some of the other jurisdictions that have legalised has made, is that they've totally excluded small growers, they've totally excluded Indigenous First Nations peoples. We've got a slight leg up here, so I think that part of our law is better expressed. There's an addressing of historic convictions. To answer John's question more fully, there is currently no proposal to expunge low-level possessory convictions. That has not been accepted. It's not part of the details so far. So, and again, we could have pushed. There could be some push for that between the passing of the referendum and the bill. That you could make an application to say there should be expungement of all historic convictions, not just an ignoring of those for the purposes of entry into the cannabis market. Most people, like Tracey said, will not be wanting to enter the market. They might want to be consumers in the market, and they will still have those convictions. But we have good models for expungement of convictions. We've done that in recent years across the board for people convicted of homosexual law offences that existed in New Zealand before 1986. Again, there are some lessons if people want to look at what's happened in other jurisdictions. California, for example, allows people to make application to have their historic convictions expunged or quashed. However, that process has been a complete nightmare. It also requires a $700 application fee, which poor-hearted people do not have. You're not going to spend $700 on that when you've got other things. So even if that happened, it would need to be done automatically and across the board without making it a discretionary or placing obligations on the applicant to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I see we've got quite a few questions there actually around that exact topic, Khylee. I think you've probably answered some of them already, but just did anyone else have anything to add on? There's a little bit of concern I can see from the questions about whether big cannabis business would come and take over from small scale growers who are maybe already operating, as has happened in America as well. And Khylee, you did touch on this, but do you guys have anything else you wanted to add on that point?
I think the bill is really clear about that, and that we have learned our lessons from alcohol and alcohol industry input and the impact that that's had, and the influence that that's had. And it's not something that that this bill is wanting or is saying it is going to be involved in, which I think is a really good thing. We don't, there'll be no advertising, for instance. Like when we think of alcohol and how that's been, how the lobbyists have kept that market strong. This bill clearly understands that and it keeps its purpose clear around harm reduction. And those principles of harm reduction.
Anyone else? Because one of the things I really like about the bill is that it sets aside a portion of the market specifically for small scale growers, which I think is really cool, and something they should have done in America and Canada but didn't, and it's come back to bite them. So I think that's really cool. Also the fact that there's a cap on growers, so no one can actually own more than 20% of the market, which will have an impact in that space as well. So I see there's also a question from Christiana about workplace drug testing. So this is a pivot, a complete change of topic, sorry guys, but how will workplace drug testing change if this bill was to go through? Because there's many people that have lost their jobs because of it. What are the panel take on that?
Yeah. Can I jump in to say something about that? There's a theme in a couple of the questions here. So it's essentially the same answer as it is for the question about will my landlord be able to stop me growing in my rental property? And the answer to that is to do with the split between public law and private law. And so what that means is by contract, as citizens, you can make agreements about your behaviour. So the criminal law and this bill, if it is passed, regulates how you can behave in public. So you can't smoke cannabis in public, you'll be able to do so in your private home. However, a tenancy agreement is a private contract in the same way that your employment agreement is also a private contract. So your landlord is entitled to say, it's not about whether or not it's lawful, generally speaking. Your landlord is entitled to say, you are not able to use this premises. It's it's part of your contract with me that you're not able to grow cannabis. In the same way that many private tenancy agreements, if not most, now say you can't smoke tobacco either. So the short answer to that is yes, your landlord can say you cannot use these premises to grow or to smoke, actually. So it's not really relevant to the fact that it's something you're allowed to do in public. Similar answer in relation to workplace testing, much because there's a distinction. So to date, people have used workplace testing as a grey area between the illegality of cannabis and the idea of impairment. Under the new regime, you can't do anything about the fact that someone has cannabis in their, in their bloods, or whatever means of testing you're going to use. Many people lost their jobs purely because of that. Because it's an illegal substance, it doesn't matter whether you're at work or at home or at school. You can't use it. If you test for it, that's unlawful. If it's lawful, but you have mahi that has an element of, well, all mahi has an element of competence to it, what is it that you are required to do? So you can have a straight up clause in your employment contract that says you are not to turn up to work intoxicated, you are not to turn up to work, whether that be by drugs or alcohol. But there is going to be more of a spin to that being about impairment. So it's not whether you are in fact have the substance in your body, but is it preventing you from doing your job? Which is of course going to be more about safety if you're talking about jobs like forestry or operation of machinery. If it's just a job that doesn't require that, then again, you're just talking about impairment. Is my teaching impaired? It might actually be enhanced, but is my teaching impaired by the fact that I've got cannabis in my bloodstream? So in other words, employers will not be able to dismiss you on the basis of you being a known user, whether you've tested positive or not, unless it's part of your employment agreement or it impairs you in the normal way that we assess competence for employment.
I think one of the issues that we need to keep talking about is how we shift our thinking around people who use drugs, and it'll be if workplaces drug tested and found that they were impaired, for instance, instead of penalising them and stigmatising them and making them unemployed, then a harm reduction approach would say that you would engage in conversation with this person and that you would be looking at offering help and assistance with that issue, as opposed to hitting people with sticks. And that seems to be the way that this country prefers to do things, I think, which is unfortunate. But we need to keep talking about this stuff taking all drug conversations out of back rooms and putting them, you know, in front of each other, so that we can have good, frank kōrero about it, you know, in a way that's framed in care, love, and aroha, not you know, get away from me. Something's wrong with you. Go over there and get some help.
Indeed. Thanks, Tracey. We had a question about Māori decision making in the bill, and I know last year there was concerns that Māori's voices weren't being heard adequately in the way the bill was drafted. There was some attempt at consultation, but just in general they didn't consult widely with anybody, let alone Māori. So do we think as a panel that the way the bill has now been drafted, that there are sufficient safeguards in there to make sure Māori voices are heard in the way it's implemented, evaluated, reviewed, and so on? We did touch on that earlier on, but Selah, did you have a view on that one?
Yeah, kia ora. I think, yeah, to address that first point around consultation, we were one of the organisations that had the joy of being consulted with. However, I think it was really inappropriate when we found out that iwi were contacted by an email to a generic iwi or marae email address that probably one of the nannies hasn't looked at for 5 years. So I think that that in itself is representation of a process that could have been administered much better. And I think, you know, there could have been an opportunity for partnership with bodies such as those represented on this line today that could have supported that consultation process. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Obviously we can't turn back time and change that process, but just to put that out there. I think that yeah, when we've looked into the detail, there is some I suppose positives, but also some areas of concern that we hold. And so with regards to the regulatory authority that will be set up, there's a Cannabis Advisory Committee that will include Māori and iwi representation. And much like all other pieces of legislation and policy work, Māori are often apprehensive or distrusting of our treaty partner because of consultation processes that do not uphold the manner in which they should. And the voices of our people are sometimes heard but not actioned upon. So we need to ensure that going forward, what this regulatory authority does with that advisory committee, and again I want to sort of highlight the word advisory. What does advisory mean? Is that just taking advice but not actually committing to anything that is advised upon? What is the decision making capability or ability of those members to actually influence decisions? Is it going to be held with the utmost mana and respect that it would deserve? So I think, you know, once we understand what that might look like, then there may be, you know, some further clarity and foresight for us. We do obviously also want to, and I think Tracey touched on it before when we were having a short discussion around the development of a national plan, and that there's going to be a review every 5 years. I and potentially others agree that that is probably too long to be reviewing. You know, 5 years is quite a long time, and quite a lot of things can happen in 5 years. So I would want to understand how we ensure that, because this is going to be a new space and we're going to be exploring the harm versus good throughout this process, should it be a yes voted by the country in September, is that to ensure we have regular check-ins throughout the infancy of this change, if there is a change, so as to ensure that we're on the right track from the outset. I suppose, yeah, we also want to ensure that there is appropriate representation and leadership opportunities within the authority itself and within the advisory committee. I would hate to see the replication or duplication of our current government agencies that don't talk to one another, that do not represent the people in which they're trying to solve the issues or problems for, and have a side committee that they talk to once every quarter or once every 6 months, as a token gesture. So, you know, some of those things are real concerns, and I think that if we are to progress, it needs to be progressed in a right way, and in the right, and in a way that is representative of that true meaningful partnership between Māori, tangata whenua and the Crown. So yeah, that's it for me on that kaupapa.
And I suppose this is obviously an issue which doesn't just apply to cannabis, but to all laws and partnership and so on. So it's a long process unpicking all of that. Yeah, so something for the select committee maybe to bring up. So relating to the select committee, someone has asked a question about what it means for this not to be binding, and I think this will have to be the last question because I noticed time's gone really fast. What does it mean for the vote not to be binding? Does it mean government might backtrack? Who wants to answer that one? Khylee, is that a good one for you?
So absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's not binding, obviously. You know, Parliament makes the law. You can have a binding referendum. They've chosen not to do so. It would be unusual to do so in relation to a piece of legislation. You could have a change of government, for example. So one of the things that we want to know in the lead up to the election is exactly what is the National Party policy on this, although obviously they've got a lot of ground to make up from their 29% on the polls. But we do want commitment from government about what their position is. So this is essentially a shot across the bows, if you like. Here's as much detail as we can give you to vote on right now. It is quite a lot of detail. There will be, you know, things that will possibly will make a difference in the regulations that will come. But the select committee process between a successful yes vote and the placement of the bill before the House again could change some of the detail that we've been talking about here. For example, in relation to those offences or the outcomes of those offences, or perhaps having a more thoughtful response to not allowing, for example, the Māori whānau to amalgamate their 2-plant limit outside of a domestic household. There are all sorts of things they can tutu with. So it's not binding, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that things that you don't currently like, you can vote yes, this is a placeholder, and then you can go to select committee and make your submissions about things that you happen to be concerned about.
Did you have something to add there, Tracey?
Oh, I just want to state something which Helen Clark said, which is, it's not a question of whether or not it should be available. It is already available. The question is on what terms we want it available. And I think that's a great way to finish this conversation. And ngā mihi kia koutou. Lovely to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Khylee.
Yeah, my pleasure. So Helen's been a great spokesperson on this topic as well. I do have to wrap up now because I see it's 12 o'clock. I'm sorry to keep you slightly over, but I think everyone who's here is really committed and passionate about this topic, so I'm sure you won't mind the extra 2 minutes. But I just wanted to say thanks so much to our awesome panelists. It's been so interesting. We've heard about, the more you get into this, the more you realise just how incredibly complex it is, and how different stakeholders and communities have such different views on all the different angles of it. And so we do have to keep unpicking these issues. We do have to keep talking about it, so that when the referendum goes through, we can go to select committee and just explain the bits that do need to change, the bits that are great. And so, yeah, I wanted to just mention Health Not Handcuffs quickly. That's an organisation that some of us are coalition partners in, and they're promoting a yes vote in the referendum. So if you're keen and inspired to get involved in a bit of campaigning, please go onto there and volunteer to be involved in that. And just in general, make sure you exercise your democratic rights, everybody, and talk to everyone you can about all the topics relating to cannabis legalisation that are important to you. Make sure you're enrolled, make sure you go out and vote, and make sure you get your friends to do so as well. This is, the referendum's on a knife edge, so we need to make sure that, everybody does their absolute utmost to get this across the line. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed your session. This will be on our website recorded if you want to look back at it. It'll also be on Facebook Live by the sound of it, if our technology has worked properly. And I think it'll also be on our YouTube channel if you want to share it with friends and colleagues. So, and we've got another webinar in 2 weeks' time, so please also sign in for that. That one's going to be on the bill from a youth perspective. And then we also have Helen Clark on the 8th of July coming to join us to talk about the case for legalisation from an international perspective. So that'll be really interesting as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Khylee, Selah and Tracey, for a really, really interesting talk. I think everyone has enjoyed it really a lot, and we've had some great questions in. So thanks everyone for participating. If you don't think your question was answered, you can go to our Facebook and we'll try and answer some of those things after the talk. So cheers, thank you everyone, and have a fabulous weekend.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ka kite.